Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of It Depends, Lessons in Technology Leadership. My name is Kevin Goldsmith. I'm your host. I'm a CTO, a former VP of engineering, former director of engineering, former engineering manager and developer. And I wrote a book, and the book is called It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership from 2012 to 2022. If you're new to this podcast, let me give you the deal. Every episode of this podcast, we include a chapter from the audio book, and I talk about it and give you a little bit of information about it. There's also a newsletter. In the newsletter, we include a chapter from the text of the book. Not as much a background about it because of the newsletter format, but we do different chapters in each of these. So if you subscribe to both, you get different chapters every week. The podcast comes out every other week. The newsletter comes out on the weeks the podcast does not. And let me remind you once again, there is a survey for listeners and readers because we are approaching the end of the book. This is chapter 29 of 36. And I'm thinking about where I want to go next and what in this podcast is working for people and what isn't. And same with the newsletter. That survey will be linked from the show notes. It's also linked from itdependsbook.net. Itdependsbook.net includes all the information about the book, includes links to this podcast, includes links to the newsletter, links to the survey. It also includes like a chapter list and, just information, links to all the different stores you can buy it, because no ads on the podcast, no ads in the newsletter, don't have a paywall or anything. So you're getting the content, the entire content of the book in both of them. So if you're learning something from this, if you're getting something from this, please consider buying the book if you haven't already. And I know a lot of you have, and I very much appreciate it. The book is continuing to sell pretty well, given that it's almost been out a year. And the podcast and the newsletter are both doing very well. I've gotten a lot of people filling out the survey, but honestly, I'd really like to get a lot more just to really understand what's working for y'all and what's not. As I said, on this episode, we're doing chapter 29, which is called Building a Management Training Curriculum at Avvo. In the last episode, we talked about Avvo, and we talked about our path to a matrix model. Very quickly summarize what we talked about in the last episode. You should go back and listen to it if you haven't heard it, because it's all about how we got to that team's model, but it's also about how you go from a very traditional hierarchy and why you would go from a hierarchy into more of a matrix model. This chapter kind of follows nicely from that, because one of the things I talked about last time was that when I joined the company as CTO, there were a ton of little teams, which is fine. It's one way of doing things. But each of those teams had a manager, which meant there were a lot of engineering managers. And when I talked to them when I first joined and I met with everybody, tell me what's going well, tell me what's not going well. And for the managers, I'd ask them, how do you like managing? Like, what do you like about being a manager at the company? What do you not like? What would you like in support and things like that to help you be a better manager? And about half of the managers told me, I don't really want to be a manager. I'm a developer. I really just want to be a developer. But as the senior developer on a team, they made me the manager. And lots of companies do that. This is not unique to that company. When I was at Microsoft, the way I became a manager at Microsoft was I was the most senior developer on a new team. So I became the manager of that team. I had a good mentor, but I had like zero training. And I wasn't a very good one because I had zero training. I talk about earlier in the book, and I talk about earlier on the podcast, part of the reason I wanted to write the book was because when I was starting in engineering management, there really wasn't a lot of support or information. I started, as I said, at Microsoft. At the time, Microsoft didn't have any really classes for employees on how to be a better manager or how to be a manager at all. So your manager would give you 5 minutes, tell you what's expected of you, and then you were on your own. And if you wanted to be a good manager and you wanted to learn about it, there weren't even a lot of resources. There was a couple, to be honest, very bad books that I found, but that was about it. And so I wasn't a very good manager. I was learning on the job and I didn't do the best job for the people that worked for me. Later, and maybe for that reason, and I wanted to be a manager because I didn't want somebody else kind of telling me what to do, which is a horrible reason to be a manager. But I didn't really understand the job. I didn't understand how to do the job well. And I wasn't particularly interested in it. I was also a senior developer interested in being a better developer, not a manager. After that kind of first experience, I went back to being a developer. And I did that for a little while and kind of went up on the individual contributor ladder until I got to Adobe. And I've told bits of the story before. So if you've heard it, I'm sorry, I'll repeat it quickly. But when I got to Adobe, Adobe took the role of the manager a lot more seriously. And I met managers who were very serious about being good managers, who cared a lot about it, who thought about it, who were good mentors. And I joined Adobe as an individual contributor. It kind of changed my way of thinking about the role, it changed my way about the possibilities of the role. That led to me deciding, you know what, I do want to do this job. So when the opportunity arose for me to go back on the management track, I took it extremely seriously. I interviewed for it for my own team. I wanted to interview for it, moved into it, and Adobe did have classes. And at that time now, there were starting to be a little bit more material. You had some good stuff from Gerald Weinberg. Michael Lopp's first book was out, Managing Humans. So I wrote the book partially because I wanted to give back. Like, I didn't have this kind of material when I was moving into management. I wanted to contribute to the corpus of that, maybe help people become better managers. How this comes back to this chapter in particular, building a management training curriculum. Because I had not a great experience and not a ton of support when I moved into management because of a lack of training, as I've moved into more senior roles, I've made it a priority to continue to train the managers that work for me and give them the support. Now, the cool thing, usually, if you're in a company where I am, where you've got at least a few hundred employees, the kind of companies I tend to work in, you've got a hopefully good HR team. And that HR team may include a learning specialist or may not, but they're oftentimes thinking about this problem and how do we train the managers. So oftentimes there is an actual manager training of some sort that the company does that you can leverage. I would say even if you're lucky enough to be in that situation, not every company I've been at has, but even if you're lucky enough to be in that situation, I think it's important for the CTO or VPE to actually set up specialized additional training for technology managers, because some of the management stuff is the same and some of it isn't. And some of the problems we face are the same as managers in finance or sales or marketing, and some of it isn't. We also tend to manage larger teams. The big teams usually in a company, especially the kind of companies I work at, will be technology, because I work in technology companies. So technology team is usually the biggest. If not, if you're a B2B team, sales might be the biggest and technology second. With consumer products, sometimes operations, and that would include stuff like customer support. Or if you're in a physical goods retailer, that would also include delivery and stuff. That might be the biggest team. But if you're a technology technology company, technology is usually going to be one of the biggest teams. So usually in technology, we're managing bigger teams than our peers, than marketing or in finance or legal. We also have different incentive structures. Sales incentive structures, operations incentive structures are very, very different than technology ones. And for this reason, I think it's important that we don't just assume HR's got this one. I think we need to take it seriously ourselves and figure out, if you are lucky enough to have existing manager training in your company, perfect. Don't replace it or don't compete with that. Build on top of that and customize it. And if you're not the CTO, if you're an engineering manager or a lead or even a director, and your CTO's not thinking about it this way, that's fine. You can build your own reading groups within your peers. You don't have to wait for somebody to hand you training. You can find opportunities and work with your peers to help level yourselves up if you're serious about it. And if you're doing this job, you should be serious about it. If you're not serious about it, go do a different job. Go back to being a developer unless you're serious about being a manager. And by the way, as I talked about with Avvo in the last episode, the whole point is that when we switch from having one manager per team to letting all the people who didn't want to be managers not have to be managers anymore, we ended up with fewer managers and teams, which is how we became a matrix organization. But the people who said they wanted to be managers were serious about being managers. If you're going to give them that choice, then it's incumbent on you to actually follow up and help them be managers, help them be better managers. So there's an agreement here, and there's a duty to the senior leadership to support these people if you're going to do something like that and really decide like, no, we're going to be serious about the role of the manager. By the way, I'm going to differentiate because I'm talking about the job of the manager, the role of the manager, managers managing multiple teams. That doesn't mean that a manager can't write code. So I've often heard it said or assumed from people, even in my own companies, that, oh, I'm a manager now, I don't code anymore. And they're managing like a 4-person team. I'm like, well, what are you going to do all day? Like, there is not enough work for you to not be coding. So maybe when you get to be running a bigger team, like 8 people, 10 people, or something like that, you might have enough management overhead, like stuff you need to do for the team, that you are, mostly doing that management. And, maybe your director is giving you projects to run for the bigger group too. Okay, yeah, absolutely. But, you shouldn't assume, oh, I'm managing a 3-person team, I no longer write code. Some companies absolutely do that. That's horrible. I think that's a bad idea. You end up with these managers looking for stuff to do. I don't like having anybody in my organization that isn't fully occupied with their work, because then they start to invent work. And a lot of times that ends up being contrary to what the organization is trying to do, because they're trying to help with limited context, or they're trying to do something that they want to do or something they think is going to be helpful. And I'd rather, no, if you're a manager and you're doing your one-on-ones and you're doing your team meetings and you're dealing with peers as appropriate and all that kind of stuff, and you still have 10, 15, 20 hours in a week, yeah, you should still be coding. Just to be clear, because I don't want someone to misinterpret me. So as I talk about it in this chapter, I'm talking about a very specific exercise I do to kick off training. I mentioned first time I did it, I knew I wanted to do manager training. This was the first time I was consciously making this choice. I worked with 2 agile coaches. They came up with the kernel of the idea I describe in this chapter, and I named them both in the chapter. Both great folks, really helped out a lot. That worked so well that when I went to Avvo, we did it at Avvo, and we did it on Fido, my next company, and we've done it at DistroKid, where I am now. So I've done it multiple times. It changes a little bit each time. And the one thing I will say, there's a lot of photos of the actual exercise with the people that I took that day while we were doing it. So you miss a little bit in the audiobook, sorry, because it makes some of the things I'm describing more clear. But it is, I think, fairly straightforward. This process of deciding what you want to work on. The next part, what happened after that, I don't talk about in this chapter, but I'll talk about now quickly. So this process, this exercise, we did at Avvo and that I did at Spotify. This exercise gives you areas to focus on. It doesn't build the curriculum. It identifies the areas to work on. Now, what we did at Avvo was probably the most advanced kind of version of this, which is, and I've done other variations, and different companies work different ways. It depends, right? That's the idea. The way we did at Avvo was kind of the most complete version, but I've used the similar ideas at other companies or parts of this. And then what we did is once we identified our 8 areas, I took each of those areas, mapped them out, I think over a month. So 8 months of training focusing on these different areas. And we did an hour a week. So we had a book club. I would find a book that talked about this particular skill. And we would have a book club where we'd all talk about the book. Hopefully you'd have a month to read the book, usually enough time. So we'd spend 1 week, that hour, book club. 1 hour would be a conference talk talking about this problem. So I'd go find a conference talk I either saw or a conference talk I could find, and I'd watch it to make sure it was appropriate on this subject that we were doing that month. And we'd watch the conference talk and then we'd talk about it. Okay, like what do we think about this? Or how do we agree? How do we disagree? What makes sense at our company? So that was another week. Another week I worked with, I was lucky enough at Avvo that we actually had a full-time training person in HR. So she and I worked on an actual class, like workshop, where every month, one of those hours was a workshop on this topic. And then the final week was an open kind of question and answer, kind of just open discussion. That would be nominally about the topic, but it was just generally like, let's meet as a group and talk about problems we're having related to this subject or not, and then give each other advice. So sort of like just a group discussion about management problems we were having in the general case. Like in the specific thing, you're going to be talking to your manager about them, right? But if it's about very specific things, but if it's something you're trying to work on in your own team, this was a good opportunity for that. So that worked out really well. It was like a nice cadence, one topic a month. And then that let us go and spend a little bit of time and approach it from different directions. And some people like reading books. Some people prefer watching conference talks. Some people like classroom exercises. And that gave everybody kind of a chance to try or to sort of work with the thing that works for them best. So it worked particularly well. People really enjoyed it. I'll say also the conference talk meeting was open to everyone. I invited all the people in the company, or certainly everybody in technology and in product. So that ended up being actually very popular. We were in an office. It was in a big conference room. It would be often full. So that was kind of cool because then you got a lot of different perspectives, including non-technology ones. The other one is that kind of open discussion forum kind of thing. I invited to that also people who were not currently managers, but were interested in becoming managers. So that was also a way to start introducing people who were thinking about potentially becoming a manager at some point into some of the stuff, into some of the challenges that they might face. It did mean we'd have to be a little bit careful about how we talked about stuff. Occasionally we'd have to say, hey, sorry, this one's got to be between the managers because it's particularly sensitive. But generally that didn't happen. And we were able to have like pretty open conversations about just management challenges. And that was a great introduction. That and the videos were a great introduction for those folks. It worked particularly well. This mechanism I described in the chapter of figuring out, because if you're the CTO or a VPE and you decide like, oh yeah, I do want to do training for the managers in my team. And you just decide, here's the curriculum I think is important. You're all going to go do it, right? I'm going to lead you through it. You could do that. You could do that. Maybe they would appreciate that. But I think by actually doing this process of what is important, that process is mostly beneficial because it helps you collectively decide what management culture in technology in your company is going to be. And if you're the leader, you aren't a passive observer of this, you're an active participant, which means if people start going in a path that you think doesn't align with kind of the vision of where you want the organization to be, then you can have that discussion. And you have to have that discussion. Creating your own curriculum and kind of forcing on everybody, and they don't necessarily believe it or agree with it, you're not going to get a lot of support, and you're not going to get a lot of interest, and you're not going to get a lot of commitment. Having that discussion at the beginning I understand you think this is important. From where I sit, here's what I think. And let's have that discussion, and maybe let's have that disagreement. And you may not convince everyone, but when you start going down that path, people at least can reference that discussion and understand where you're coming from. And you may still not get the level of commitment you'd like, but you'll get a much better level of commitment than if you just pretended that this is what was all happening all along. So I really do like this process as a way of doing it. Like I said, I've done it multiple times in multiple companies. It has been universally liked, universally supported. People get excited about it. I think the biggest problem I've had is when we do that process and then for one reason or another, other stuff's happening in the company, and then we don't get into that training, that which has happened, and that is kind of a letdown, as you can imagine, because everyone gets excited. We're going to go work on this, and then we don't. If that happens, just do it again. Just do the process again. If there's a significant amount of time or the managers in the organization, you add new managers or whatever, do the process, kickstart the process again, and just do it again. And it'll be kind of interesting to see like what's the same, what's different if the group changes slightly or with the benefit of time between it. So now I present to you Chapter 29, Building a Management Training Curriculum at Avvo, from It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership, 2012 to 2022. Building a Management Training Curriculum at Avvo. Originally published on October 5th, 2017. This week, we kicked off manager training for Avvo technology managers. Before building a curriculum, we needed to decide what was essential to learn and where we as a group needed the most development. If I had done this with my organization at Adobe years ago, I might have made a list of capabilities or requirements for our roles and then assessed each person against those requirements. I've since learned that the top-down approach tends to isolate and alienate people. It is something done to them. They don't feel investment or ownership of the process. If they disagree with the list or my assessment of them, it is hard to challenge due to the nature of the process. At Spotify, I worked with Paulo Brolin Echeverria and Mats Olden to build manager training for my tribe. They developed an excellent kickoff exercise that I repurposed for my team at Avvo. The process is straightforward. We began by individually thinking about the qualities of a good leader in our organization. We each wrote every important quality we could think of onto individual Post-its. This effort took about 20 minutes. Then one by one, we put each of our Post-its onto a large board. As we placed each quality, we explained why we believe it was important for a leader at Avvo. When we finished putting all our Post-its on the board, we affinity grouped them. Affinity grouping resulted in 30 groups of similar qualities and a few individual Post-its that did not fit into any group. The grouping process required much more discussion so that we could all agree on the final groupings. At this point, we had collectively described 30 essential qualities of a leader at Avvo, which is far too many to focus on effectively. To narrow things down, we each received 6 votes to put towards any group of qualities we felt were the most critical. Then we tallied the votes and took the top 8 as our core qualities of a manager at Avvo. The voting process also led to many valuable discussions as we saw where we had voted as a group. Were these the right 8 qualities? Were they the most significant 8? The 8 qualities we picked were empathy, develops autonomy, builds good teams, is real and trustworthy, is a big picture thinker, supports mastery, gives feedback, and has a bias for action. Individually, we then assessed ourselves against the 8 core qualities on a 3-point scale. I need training on this, need training but it can wait, and I can train others on this. One by one, we went up to a board with the 8 qualities mapped on a spider graph. We put dots on a line for each quality where we rated ourselves. We explained why we chose that assessment. This exercise led to a further discussion about assessing ourselves against these qualities. The group found this exercise to be very valuable. We had excellent discussions on what it means to be a good leader at our company, including the values we agree on and those we don't. We also prioritize the values collectively so that everyone feels ownership and allegiance to them. And we came to an understanding of where we need to develop the most as a group. This mutual understanding will inform the curriculum for our management training, my original goal. I hope that chapter was informative. I hope with the context I gave beforehand might have also made it even more valuable. If you're thinking about this for your team, even if you're not building a training curriculum, but you want to decide collectively, like what is the role of the manager in our company, that's a good exercise to do. Just don't do it with the like, all right, let's figure out where we are and let's figure out how we're going to get better collectively. But it is a good exercise. It's a valuable exercise. And like I said, people really enjoyed it and got value from it. If you do want to see the photos, you could buy the book, obviously. But if you want to see the pictures, you can go to the March 10th edition of the newsletter on Substack. And that has the text of the chapter plus the photos from the chapter. And you'll see a photo in the newsletter from New Orleans, which is because that was where we had literally just done this exercise as part of a tech manager offsite at DistroKid, which is my current company. So this is not something I invented and talk about and never did. This is something I do every company. And there's a reason. And the reason is because it works pretty well. I'll remind you again, please fill out the survey. If you haven't yet, you can get to it there's a link in the show notes. It's just a Google form. It's anonymous. You can say whatever you want. I'm not going to be offended. It is also linked from itdependsbook.net. It's right in the middle of the page. There's a link to the survey there. I will say I've been getting good questions in the survey or ideas, stuff people want me to talk about. I will talk about those things as we're approaching the end. We only have a few chapters left now. As we're approaching the end of the book, I'm planning a few extra episodes at the end to answer some of the questions that I've been receiving that I haven't answered. So maybe do a couple episodes of just Q&A. So also please send your questions if you have them to contact@itdependsbook.net, and I'll answer them in those Q&A episodes. I've got enough to maybe do 2 or 3 now. And also some good suggestions of topics you would like me to cover after we're done going through the book. And I will be trying to do all of those as well. So really appreciate the folks who've already filled out the survey. Really appreciate the folks who sent me questions. Going to answer them all, going to address them all, just probably after we reach the end of the book. I will see you next week in the newsletter. I will see you 2 weeks back here on the podcast. Have a great week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.